We do have some coffee and tea at the back and a couple treats if you want to help yourself. But let me first start by saying thank you so much for coming out on a March evening. It's still, although the weather's improving, it's still a little bit dark out there, and thank you for taking an interest in our community, in our province, and ultimately the country and the world. I've met most of you. I see many familiar faces and friends, maybe a few faces I haven't yet met, but I'm Kody Blois. I'm your Member of Parliament here in Kings-Hants. And really the point of the town halls that we've been hosting, we started last night in Wolfville, and before that we had actually done one in Berwick, so we're going to be doing a series across Kings-Hants, is really to get out and be able to share a little bit about the work that's happening in Parliament, some of the work that I do specifically as your Member of Parliament, and but also use this as a mechanism for feedback. I learn best when I'm outside my four walls and being in the community and hearing different opinions, hearing different feedback, issues, whether or not they're here specifically in the East Hants area, whether or not it may be national issues or international issues. There's a lot going on in the world, to say the least. So again, thank you for your interest. What I thought I could do is just explain a little bit of my background, some of my parliamentary roles, a little bit about Budget 2024 and kind of the frame that we go into. We know that that budget is going to be April 16th on Tuesday. The Minister of Finance has announced that. And maybe some of the priorities that I'm hearing coming through the office. The town halls are always an opportunity to hear different pieces, or people might want to raise specific concerns, but I can give you a bit of a sense of what's coming through my office, and you can let me know if that accords with what you're hearing and feeling on the ground as well. And then really I just want to turn it over and we can facilitate conversation. We don't have an exceptionally large crowd tonight, so I'll take the time necessary. And if there's something specific you want to wait around afterwards, I'm always happy to make myself available. If it's a question that you want to ask more in an intimate setting, happy to do that as well. That's part of why I'm here. So just a little bit about me and my background. I actually grew up in this community here in Lance. My father was a truck driver. He drove with Dexter. My mom's administrative assistant. She still works here at Maple Ridge. And we really came from a family that was blue collar, paycheck to paycheck. Education was big in the household, and I was fortunate enough to be connected at a young age through organized sport. I'm a former competitive hockey player and athlete, and that was my connection at a young age here in the community. I started to take an interest in politics and public affairs when I was taking a university degree at St. Mary's University. I majored in a commerce degree, minored in poli-sci. I went on and took a Master of Management in Public Administration and a law degree from Dalhousie. And as I kind of joked last night at Wolfville, I went from watching Sportsnet and TSN to legislative TV and CPAC. I kind of fell into it. I made a deliberate choice at a young age to not join a political party. I wanted to take some time to see where I actually fit on the ideological spectrum. As you know, I ended up running for the Liberal Party in 2019. That's when I was first elected, and subsequently elected in 2021. Part of the reason why I ran for the Liberal Party is really three things. One was our past Member of Parliament, Scott Bryson, who had served for 22 years, had a lot of, I see a few nodding heads, well known in this community, well known in the riding, and I think anyone who was young and interested in politics would have been drawn to his service to Canadians at the time. Second of all, coming from a family where we were paycheck to paycheck, the Prime Minister was talking a lot in 2015 about supporting lower and middle income Canadians. And that was something that really resonated with me. Obviously I didn't run in 2015, but it was a message that stayed when I ultimately got involved in 2019. And at the end of the day, I identify as a centrist. People will have different political values, views across the spectrum. I think there's good ideas, frankly, amongst all the parties that are out there, but by and large, I see myself in the middle of the political spectrum. And the Liberal Party traditionally has held that spectrum in the country in terms of being that vehicle for those types of values. Some of you will know, having been in this community, I was involved in coaching minor hockey, minor softball, and had started a couple different organizations, the East Hants Sport Heritage Society and the Come Home East Hants Association, which had been facilitating and is still facilitating Tide Fest, which is the homecoming event that we've had. Part of the reason why I got involved in running in politics was passionate about wanting to serve community. I was a lawyer before this at McGinnis Cooper in Halifax. It's a law firm here locally. And I always have my side projects, those passion projects at the side of my desk, but part of the reason why I put my name forward is this was an opportunity to be able to work on things that matter to people and in our community every single day. So that's a little bit about me. Some of you, that would be old hat because you've known me for quite some time. For some of you who may not, I just wanted to give some background. In terms of, quickly about my parliamentary work, for the Atlantic Liberal Caucus, and what that means is we have 24 Liberal members of Parliament here in Atlantic Canada. When the House of Commons sits, which is about 26 weeks of the year that I'm in Ottawa, every Wednesday the entire Liberal Caucus will come together to have conversations about what's happening in the country, frankly, what's happening around the world. As part of our caucus reporting structure, each regional caucus has 3 minutes to present to the Prime Minister and Cabinet about the issues that matter to our particular region. And so my job is to be that voice for our Atlantic Canadian colleagues. We always meet immediately before National Caucus as an entire Atlantic group to talk about the issues that are specific to our region. So that's been something that I think has been really valuable in terms of being able to try to play a leadership role within the caucus. And you know, our region needs to have a voice, and I think we have. I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. I'm also the chair of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food, and you can't think about Kings-Hants without thinking about our agricultural community and what it means to our communities. I think you'll have to tell me, Ralph. I think we had the most milk production in the entire province in Hants County. Is that right? I think it's close. We've got a lot in terms of, especially dairy here in East Hants, but as you go further down the Annapolis Valley and West Hants on that side. So definitely a big priority for us. So it's a good portfolio. Just to quickly, in terms of the budget frame heading in this year, and I'm happy to take some budget feedback. We're kind of getting at the 11th hour, but if you have some things that you might want to signal as priorities, I'm happy to take that back in my work. Miss Freeland has a difficult job to walk right now because we're in an environment where I know affordability is a top of mind issue for, I think, frankly, almost everyone, regardless of what your income level may be, but particularly for lower and middle income families. Inflation has hit hard. Frankly, we've been able to get our inflation numbers back down in and around that 3% threshold, which is good news. And the reason why I want to highlight on that is because it'll be cold comfort for some in terms of the impacts it's having, but when you look at comparator countries around the world, Canada is actually in a relatively strong position in relation to both our inflation and the affordability challenges that we're facing. That doesn't mean that we should stop. That doesn't mean I'm saying here I'm satisfied. Absolutely not. But I think it's important to understand that context about what's happening around the world, particularly in the inflation piece. Tiff Macklin, who's the governor of the Bank of Canada, has signaled that the hope is that there will be cuts in the interest rate, which, look, if you have a mortgage, if you're a business that owns debt, anyone that has money that is owing in any capacity, that has a real impact on you. And so the job of our government is to try to make sure we continue to advance programs that matter to Canadians, that matter on affordability, but at the same time not have a budget that would unnecessarily delay the Bank of Canada actually decreasing those interest rates. So that's the frame that we come into. There's been a lot of programs that I think have mattered. Happy to talk about them with you, but I think that's where we come. In terms of my focus specifically as a member of Parliament, again, affordability, I know it just in terms of what has come through my office, but also the survey results that we've been surveying in the community. We know that that's the #1 issue right now for many people. Housing, I'll tell just a very quick story. In 2019, when I first went and started knocking on doorsteps here in our communities, less so maybe right in the corridor, but particularly in other areas of the municipality, you would go knock on someone's door and you would see a for sale sign on their lawn, and they'd answer the door and they'd say, "Kody, one of the things that worries me is I've been trying to sell my house for a year or two, and I'm worried no one will actually buy it and I won't be able to go and downsize or be able to move to a different community." That's no longer an issue. In fact, the challenge is, do we have enough housing to keep up with the population growth that has happened? The good news is, when I would have graduated university back in, when I was coming through high school and university, kind of in that 2010, 2014 era, a lot of people my age were moving away. They were not staying in Nova Scotia. And so the fact that we have people that want to be in our communities in Nova Scotia, that want to be specifically here at East-Hants, is a good thing, but we need the housing and infrastructure to be able to keep up. I hope to have some good news to be able to share shortly on the housing front in partnership with the municipality, and we can talk about that. But I know affordability, housing, healthcare are always top 3 issues. I mentioned agriculture and small business. That is an area that I've tried to put a focus on. And the last I would say would be community service organizations. Sandra, I see you here. I don't know if I don't think you're any longer the Milford Recreation President, maybe, but. Oh, you just came from Milford Rec, yeah. But you think about what stitches our communities together. It is fire halls, and the men and women who are stepping up in the instance of challenges in our communities, but also putting on the community breakfast. You think about the legions. You think about recreation associations that have driven our communities. So I've tried to take a particular emphasis in working close with those types of community organizations to deliver it. We were fortunate enough, Sandra, to be able to get some support from Milford Rec, and I know that your group is putting that to good use, and there would be other examples. So I could talk at great length. I would love to be able to go further, but really this is your time. I just wanted to give a bit of a preamble. And maybe if you have hands, I'm happy to take questions, comments. I would ask you to keep it, I don't mind a preamble and some context, but relatively succinct, just in case most people want to say something here tonight. So I'll open the floor to anyone who may have a question or comment. Don't be shy. Lino.
Kody, running a business in the community is a good thing. The challenges right now is the taxes being taken from underneath business owners. I've reached out. I'm going to be talking about tobacco taxes.
Okay.
So for the smokers, probably not many of us here beside me. None of them buy cigarettes from my store, which is good. The biggest cut right now is the illegal cigarettes in the market. It's big. I'm talking, I run one of the busiest stores in the community, I believe, and according to my suppliers, I always been the busiest store selling tobacco products. Shame on you smokers. But, so right now, my sales have went down half, and our federal government think that people are smoking less because of all the new regulation. I really enjoyed the new regulation of, ugly pictures on the cigarettes and making it harder for people to smoke and putting the prices up. But the biggest picture is the government's not getting it, and I've reached out to tobacco inspectors, I reached out to provincials, politicians, I reached out to the task force for tobacco, I reached out to your office in the past, and there's nothing has been done about the illegal tobacco in the market, which is right now retail for third the price that retail on legal products. And I'm talking huge numbers.
Yeah.
Stores like mine drop 50% in sales. I'm not concerned over the profit on the cigarette because it's really minimum to my business. But my concern is the tax dollar that disappearing from our pocket, from our future pocket for the hospitals, and that's why I'm a big fan of the tobacco taxes, right? So nobody has done nothing about it, from provincials, politicians, from staff and all these task forces, from tobacco inspectors, and they say you have to take notes. They're being sold everywhere, whether in a trunk of a car, job site, fire hall legions, any place where there's gathering up employees or people, right? It's everywhere. Nobody done nothing about it. And it's not being done nothing about it, and it's big money.
Yeah. So look, I hear where you're coming from, Lino. In fact, I guess tobacco vaping would also be in that category as well. In terms of, I had a call from a gentleman in New Minas who ran a vaping shop, who similarly was frustrated, in part because he knew exactly who the individuals were who were selling illegally, had sought to address this with the police, and felt as though the police were not taking the requisite action to try to intervene, and the frustration involved. I actually ended up having a conversation with the Kings County RCMP and I'll say their lead liaison officer, who actually runs that shop, who was cognizant of who this individual was. And the challenge came down to a couple things. Ultimately, policing, yes, is federal in the sense that everyone knows the RCMP is a federal body, but provincial policing is contracted by the province. And what his argument, what his frustration was kind of the lack of resources within his own agency to be able to go out and properly establish the evidence necessary to secure a conviction from the Crown in terms of what this looked like from a criminal prosecution. So in that instance, cognizant of it, knew who it was, lacked the police resourcing, and I think that this becomes a conversation about what role does the Government of Canada have in partnership with the province and also municipalities, because our municipal tax dollars go to supporting policing in our communities as well. Rural policing is also a big deal. Now, I know your shop's right in downtown Elmsdale, but it's about that same dynamic. How do we have those resources in place? So there's vaping, there's tobacco. I know those are connected through cigarettes, and cannabis is the other one. Because we legalized cannabis, which I think was the right tact, it was the right thing to do. But you talk to the cannabis manufacturers who would express similar frustration about the policies around excise of cannabis, and then the frustration about the fact that they're getting undermined in the legal market. So I don't have a perfect answer for you here today. It is something that I think is important. I think in relation to the cannabis, we've had conversations. I know one of my colleagues, Jaime Batiste, for example, in terms of Indigenous communities and how that right can be established through the ban versus individuals. Like that is ability. I know it's not just Indigenous communities, there's other organized crime and other elements that are out there. But we need to make sure that we have a protocol in place, at least something I take away, and ask what more can we do. And maybe it's a conversation I can have with John to say, is it coming down to what we can do at the provincial side to actually have more police and more resources on the ground to be able to establish the evidence that they suggest is necessary for Crown prosecutors to be able to make their case. I see your hand, but yeah.
And the biggest catch with that too, that I'm kind of disappointed sometimes certain laws are provincial, certain are federal. I believe certain things should be all federal under one banner. As an example, if you live in Nova Scotia, a carton of cigarette costs you, for example, $100. You buy it from Ontario over the phone, right? And there's certain brand you can get here, for example, like flavored tobacco, flavored vape, is the same issues, right? You can't buy it in Nova Scotia. We as a business people, we're not allowed to sell it, but then you can pick up the phone right now and you can order a carton of menthol or cherry flavor or whatever it is out there, right? And have it delivered to here. The taxes is being staying there. We're not getting the taxes here, but when we get sick and get cancer, our tax dollar here is treating us so that it's not a fair policy, I believe.
Yeah.
That, the tobacco should be, in my point of view, tobacco should be under one federal law. Yep. And why the case of beer in New Brunswick is $8 cheaper, for example, I don't know if it is or not, but why cheaper in New Brunswick than it's cheap than Nova Scotia? Why can't a cigarette in New Brunswick cheaper than here, right? People living on the border, they're crossing the border.
I take your, on the federal piece, we control the marketing, under the Constitution, and so it's how you can market the product, the elements, the price point is still provincial, including some of those dynamics that you talked about, but I take the point. And the last question I'll ask, Lino, is I presume, even from your customers who would come through, that you would have some sense of who's facilitating this illegal market. Have you had conversations with local police about this conversation, or it's?
I personally wouldn't bother with our local police because I believe they're already overstretched doing what they do. But this is really not a life matter issues, right? So I think it's only $1. So I believe our politicians should be really focusing on that, so we can have more taxes to pay each other.
Yeah, I appreciate raising.
So I'll leave that with you on that matter, and hopefully you can come up with something. Okay, who's the next?
Go ahead, Steve.
Hi, Kody. I just wanted to touch on affordable housing, and it's a big issue here. I think sometimes it gets lost in the shuffle here. I know Turner Drake recently, the last few months, completed a study on housing, overall housing, for every municipality in Nova Scotia. And in the report, it stated East-Hants doesn't have a housing shortage, and in its recommendations for the next 10, 20, 30 years, we would need something like 3,000 new housing units to meet our need. Well, already in the hopper with our own municipality, there's between 5,000 and 6,000, and it's growing every week. So the issue is not the housing needs, the issue is affordability. And I think what happens to a lot of our younger people and seniors and whatnot is they're looking, and finally they get so desperate that they move out of the area. So when CMHA, or CMHC, and others, do some of the research, we're not picking up those numbers and whatnot. But living here, and I've lived here a long time, there are a lot of young people, I know there's a lot of seniors as well, that housing is just becoming so unaffordable. I'm hoping you'll have good news later on with the municipality and whatnot, whether it's tiny home developments. People need safe, quality living. But I think in East-Hants, with all of the growth and our average income here is probably the highest in the province. So affordable housing sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, but I think it's a lot bigger issue than what may show up in some of these reports. Yep. And I think it's sort of quasi-provincial federal.
Yep.
I know it's not municipal unless they partner with you. I think it's something that we really have to keep on the center of the radar screen to keep our people here, and we want people working in the service industries and whatnot, which are lower paid, but Jesus, they can't afford even an apartment. So anyway, thank you.
So on the housing front, and without completely letting the cat out of the bag,
I didn't do that to.
No, it's okay. No, part of what the government has been doing, because look, honest to God, the government of Canada is about the farthest away from the actual approval and permitting of housing. We have a role to play in terms of immigration levels, in terms of skilled workers coming who can actually build housing. How do you manage the resources of new housing being built with, I would say, healthcare systems and making sure elements are in place. What I would say is our policy has been a couple things, has been to work directly with developers to try to bring down the costs associated with building housing. And what I mean by that is things such as, we have a program called the Rental Construction Financing Loan. What it does is it provides low interest loans that would be below commercial bank rates to individuals who are building homes on the promise that as part of that cost savings that they will incur, because they are not having to finance at a higher level with the banks, that money can be put into affordable units that would be associated with the project. There is always open questions about what is affordable, and that is a moving metric depending on what locality you live in. That is one example of where we've been working. Sometimes we've been working with not-for-profit organizations directly, saying, here's an allocation of money, let's go out and build housing for social purposes. If Sean Fraser were here, part of what he would tell you is that for a number of decades, the government of Canada largely got out of the game of investing in social housing, public housing. We left the market to its devices. That's important. Many people can afford that. That's great. But there are a number of units that, whether it be cooperative or social, the government of Canada just hadn't funded. So we are getting back into that game. It's going to take time. There's no easy solutions here in the short term. On affordable use housing itself, I didn't know this, but East-Hants as a municipality has never had an affordable housing strategy. It's never formed the basis of how we built housing in this community. Without, again, letting the cat out of the bag, that will start to change over time. The municipality, I think, and its council is understanding that as part of the development of new housing, there has to be units that are, to your point, Stephen, that are focused on seniors, particularly seniors on fixed income, who that's a challenging element in terms of rising rents, and lower and middle income families who just can't afford to be able to get a down payment. So there's a lot in on the housing. I would argue the other piece that the municipality can do is around zoning and their actual bylaws of what is permitted. So I'll give the municipality credit. One of the things that I think they did just recently is they've allowed accessory dwelling units across the entire municipality. So if you have a single detached home you will, anywhere in the municipality, you were able to add an accessory dwelling unit, essentially a granny suite or, you know, another unit that can be brought in. What is not permitted right now is, let's say you have a duplex on a particular area and you wanted to create a unit in a basement. That's still not allowed from the municipality. So there's some things that can be done, I really think, at the closest local level to be able to allow for that density and to allow for units that are more affordable. Because at the end of the day, not everyone, we're not going to be able to have a situation where everyone will have a large square home and it's going to be necessarily affordable, particularly with challenges that are there.
One of the programs that the federal government had a few years ago, and I think it was an excellent program, I know we took advantage of it, was a non-refundable tax credit for home improvements and whatnot. And I think the ceiling was 15 or 20,000. So that non-refundable tax credit meant a lot of, you know, more money back in your pocket. But it did 2 or 3 other things. If you did the work yourself, you could only claim the materials. But a lot of folks had to hire, you know, craftspeople, and whether it's electricians, plumbers, or whatever,
Yep.
and buy supplies and materials. So it had a ripple effect, you know, and it's not something that the federal government had to put a lot of money out,
Yep.
in the, you know, to do it. And of course, you're going to argue that there wasn't quite as much coming back in. But that ripple effect, I know it was a lot of us, whether we were doing floors or decks or whatever, it was just enough to encourage us to do the project. And then we, you know, we shop locally.
Yep.
And that helped local shops, and it helped, you know, local tradespeople. And it's something that doesn't, you know, in the big picture, doesn't cost the federal government an outlay of money. And you have to do something in order to get that non-refundable tax credit, which is what I like. You know, you're actually earning it, but it can make a huge difference. You know, that extra few $1,000s.
Yep. I'll double check, Josh and I will go back. I think we still have some incentives around the accessory dwelling unit. Your point was around broader home investment and
But what triggered it was the accessory dwelling units, because that could be enough of an incentive to do it.
Yep, no, of course. So let me go back and see what we have, and I'll get back to you on that.
Thank you.
You mentioned
Just your name and where you're from. I forget your first name.
Sam.
Sam, sorry, Sam. Yep.
I'm from Shuby.
Yep.
You mentioned earlier about all of the parties having good policies.
Yep.
Do you think there's any good to the idea that the opposition leader's always talking about on this, where he wants to withhold municipal funding or federal funding to municipalities that have excessive red tape as far as building housing goes?
I thank you for the question. It's a good one. On this particular housing policy, no, and I'm not an expert on housing policy, but Mr. Poilievre does have a private member's bill that he's introduced. Part of the focus on that bill from folks that know a lot more about housing and the economics around housing, they've actually critiqued it as being not as proficient as what's actually on the table now from the Government of Canada in terms of what's there. The Globe and Mail ran an interesting piece, and it was in a case example in Montreal. Because what Mr. Poilievre is talking about is that he would reward those who build more housing on a proportion of how many houses they built the year before. But it could have an adverse impact. So for example, the Globe and Mail rightfully pointed out that a particular suburban community in Montreal that built 600 units last year would be required to build 690 units the next year in terms of that increase of what they're doing year over year. But a community that built 4 houses the year before would be expected to build, 2 houses and would be rewarded. I also don't think that we should be penalizing Canadians per se if they have local government that is maybe not actually helping to deliver the housing that Canadians expect. He's taking a tone that is actually been quite vindictive towards municipal councils, calling mayors and different local leaders incompetent. I would take the view that we're better off to actually want to partner with municipalities, have conditional funding from the Government of Canada that says, we expect you to do X, Y, Z, to be able to move the needle on some of the things that Stephen was just talking about. So, yeah, I think there's good ideas across the spectrum, but on that particular piece of policy that he's advanced, I'm not a big fan.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks, Sam. I've got this gentleman and this gentleman back here. Just your, yeah. Yeah, you first.
Hi, Kody.
Yeah.
Ryan Dunphy.
Yep.
I'm on Robert Scott Drive since 19 years.
Yep.
And we've been dealing with some flood water since 2005 when the sidewalks were put in,
Yep.
when the culverts were redirected there.
Yeah.
It's been getting worse, and the underlying issue is the culvert at the tracks. It's aging infrastructure, and to complicate it more, it's municipal land, and now there's beavers causing some problems,
Okay.
and that's provincially regulated.
Okay.
So I've been working with John a little bit, Walter Tingley, he's been quite a help right now. There's a lot of housing approved across the street from us. I think in total 3,700 residential units, probably next 20 years. The engineer at the municipality, Jesse, currently the municipality doesn't have anything for climate change for their stormwater retention. After July, I can assure everyone climate change is real. We were pretty concerned last Friday night there with Barney's Brook. The volume of water in that area is seeing that culvert is definitely exceeding its capacity. When you walk down there, the rail bed's acting as a dam, and what's happening, Barney's Brook is filling that area as a fishbowl, and it's actually, the water's running backwards up the brook across the number 2 highway. That's what happened
As
in
opposed to
July.
draining out towards Dutch settlement of
The
that.
tracks is holding it, so the river's actually not, the river's high, the Shuby River, but it's not up to the tracks, or it's in the sod field,
Okay.
but the water can't exit because of the rail bed.
Okay, so the rail bed and the culvert that actually is flushing out Barney's Brook into the Shubenacadie River is
Yeah.
being overwhelmed.
So it's Barney's Brook and it's also Blacksmith's Brook, the two of them intersect just ahead of the rail bed.
Yep.
But what's happening, this Blacksmith's Brook is what's behind Robert Scott Drive. Once Barney's Brook and that lower floodplain gets filled up, it's a small lake, it starts backing up and running backwards up Barney's Brook.
Yep.
So we're hoping your government can work with CN to try to, I believe Perry Mitchell Morris provided you with a report. Do you know Perry?
I do know Perry, I
Yeah.
coach his sons in hockey.
Yeah.
So the report, if it has come in, I haven't had the chance to take a look at
Okay,
it.
he's presented it to the municipality.
Okay.
And they're working on, I think they've been good about it, they're looking at updating some stormwater retention ponds to
Okay.
control the flow, and I think that might be incorporated in these new developments.
Yep.
But we really, I think CN needs to do something with this culvert, it's an archway, and it looks original.
Okay.
And it's been updated with a culvert type pipe on the end of it, but
Okay.
it's undersized, and currently on a normal day, it's over at half capacity all the time,
Okay.
so.
You and I had a conversation about this, and part of where I first started was to get CN to come out and look at it. And
Yeah, I haven't, you called me back there, but I haven't heard from anybody from CN.
So one of their individuals who's responsible for looking at the track, I had asked them, I said, can you go out and look at this particular culvert? Their response was, look, came out, everything looks fine. Now, it might have been on a nice sunny day where it wouldn't have looked like this was under threat.
Yeah.
But I appreciate the more level of detail, and maybe, I'm home now for 3 of the next 4 weeks, so maybe you're busy in your own right, but maybe we can find a time and I can go out and get some pictures and be able to share it with CN
Okay.
on that side. The government of Canada doesn't directly control CN, as you can appreciate, but given the fact that it's under federal, jurisdiction with the transportation agency, it can be something that at least we can push, and I can help kind of join forces, particularly if the municipality and the province have expressed their willingness to want to do something. And I take your point that as we add more housing
Yes.
and there's more water be going through that area.
Well, the concern is the housing is using this brook that's behind Robert Scott Drive, all the stormwater settling ponds in the concept plan is this waterway.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it's going
Yep.
to contribute more flow to the area.
And you've described in a way now that I can visualize it in terms of the Barney's Brook. So, but let's go see it.
Yeah.
I'll commit to doing that before the end of March,
Okay.
and let me see what I can do to wrangle down CN, and then I'll have a conversation with the municipality specifically to see. Jesse Thomas, you mentioned.
Jesse,
Not Thomas. Sorry, I'm thinking of a journalist. Holzman, I think.
yes,
Yeah.
that's what it is.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for raising that.
Like Robert from Enfield. Back on the housing, I think we talked with the population group. The concern that I have is that, and I think there's some inkling of looking to government, the reduction in the international students, or capping that over there, we've seen it happen in our province, and other provinces as well. And also the temporary temporary residents there. Those numbers, I think we're gonna cap them as well. But I'm concerned with the strain that's having on housing. And you kind of mentioned the population growth, which is great on population growth, but I'm not sure we're prepared to handle it. And I know the housing minister is building homes, but what about the roads? What about the sewage? What about the schools? What about the policing? Right, so we're not ready to handle it.
So a couple things, you touched on a few different elements. I'm going to work backwards though in your comments. What we have on infrastructure is what's called the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Plan. And so in Nova Scotia, what that has represented over the last about 6 years has been about $830 million of federal funding that the province has essentially the ability to draw down to in 4 different streams. One is public transit, which has been largely in and around Halifax, as you can appreciate. There are some other transit authorities elsewhere in the province. Some has been what's identified as green infrastructure, which has largely been used by municipalities around wastewater and water development, to your point about being able to keep up. There was another stream around recreation and sport, communal infrastructure, and the last was a rural infrastructure stream, which was basically wide open and the province could use almost on roads on whatever way that they wanted. And so, like on the federal side, I'm going to suggest that we've largely been there for infrastructure projects. There's a lot of work to be done. We've been doing from $6 million in Shubenacadie here in East-Hants to grow that, to Port Williams, Canning, Christ, there's been stuff all around the riding. But I take your point about the need to continue to focus on that. And I think about this community, for example. If our municipal officials were here, they would tell you the biggest piece of infrastructure that is coming down the line is a new water plant that's needed to support the growth here. It's going to be about $30 million. $30 million is just shy of what a municipal operating budget is in this municipality on any given year. So, I mean, these are some of the costs that are coming that are the good problems to have, I would say, with growth, and they have to be managed. And I take your point on that. On temporary foreign workers, I take the view that we need temporary foreign workers. We need people who are going to come to our communities and contribute, and I'll tell you why. And particularly maybe influenced because of my relationships in the Annapolis Valley as I've been on this job for 5 years. 2,000 workers a year come to the agriculture industry from Mexico and Jamaica specifically. If you talk to our agriculture producers in the Annapolis Valley, we wouldn't have an agriculture industry without that labor. And I'll take you back to the middle of the pandemic. There was a lot of uncertainty in that first summer, 2020, people called the office and parents would say, Kody, I'm looking for a job for my son or daughter. Do you know of anything? I said, well, yeah, I do. I've got a job tomorrow if you want. Oh, great, where's that at? Oh, it's working for 18 or 19 bucks on the farm, at so-and-so, the apple farm. No, I don't want my son or daughter to work in that. And so I think we have to change our mindset around this is not grandfather's farm anymore. These are sophisticated businesses. There's opportunities in agriculture. But it comes to the point that right now, with a baby boomer demographic that is retiring by and large, getting close to retirement, there has been a mass exodus in that labor force. If you do not have a requisite youth population that's helping to replace that workforce, it's going to have consequences in our economy. So I think it has to be smart. I think it has to be thoughtful. I go around to long-term care facilities in this province. The face of the long-term care worker in this province looks a lot different than the average Nova Scotian would have 20, 30 years ago. Go to a restaurant here in this community. Go to any type of job. People are working hard, and I don't think that immigrants take anything away from what we, I think it's a strength to our economy, it's a strength to our country and our social fabric. So that would be where I would stand. On the international students piece particularly, and I want to raise this, there have been institutions in the country that were becoming just a funnel through for job opportunities. It was not even about school anymore. In Nova Scotia, there was only one university or institution that was starting to get on the fringe of becoming a little bit overboard. It's Cape Breton University. And I don't chagrin the fact that they have created a pathway where they were drawing international students from around the world, particularly from India. It's a good thing. But the rapid growth that university saw over a short period of time And I have the numbers of asylum claims that were coming from international students in certain institutions. That was one of the issues. And again, it's not to out Cape Breton, and I'm not here to fight with David Dingwall or anyone else, but that was the one case example. I don't think Acadia is breaching its responsibilities. There is a broader conversation, though, about how we fund post-secondary institutions in this province and in this country. Because what has happened is, I think it's extremely good that universities have created those links to around the world that bring people to little old Annapolis Valley or to Nova Scotia or whatever the case may be. It's good for us long-term to have that, but not if the universities have been created and forced to do that as a result of them not having adequate funding in the first place to maintain their operations. So there's a bit of a come to Jesus moment here that I think the province and the universities have to have about the funding model. Our government took the approach, and all we've done on the international students is move the clock back 2 years. So whatever the universities had in terms of available international students 2 years ago, if the province chooses to keep that the same, I don't think you're going to see a major impact. I think certain institutions that were abusing and I think becoming a little bit non-legitimate in how they were attracting students without proper resources in place, that's the goal and that's the focus. And provinces are going to have to delineate how those international students who are coming to Nova Scotia or Ontario or New Brunswick, how those seats will be allocated accordingly. So I hear you. I think it's a balance, but we're the first time in a long time Nova Scotia is actually seeing a growth in its population. And that's being driven by a couple things. Yeah, we had a lot of people from elsewhere in the country that wanted to come move to Nova Scotia, particularly during the pandemic, and have stayed. The other piece is we're actually just retaining international students and immigrants who actually want to live in our province for the first time in a long time, and I think that that's extremely important to our long-term prosperity. Notwithstanding, I hear you on the challenges about managing and making sure that there's proper infrastructure and proper social services in play.
Yeah, I agree with the temporary workers. It's not a concern on, that's not the main concern. The concern is the volume. And we're seeing now cracks in the system, and it takes a long time to fix them. And there's going to be substantial cost to that, and who's going to bear that cost? When all of we talked about our affordability of housing, our gas prices, our cost, everything's going to go up. So who's going to provide that funding? So growing is a good problem to have. I think it's the volume that was the concern about it. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think our government has signaled that that's going to be something we're watching closely in the days ahead. One of the things that we still have in this country that I do not think we want to lose is Canada's one of the best within the G7, I would say, compared to countries, for being positive on immigration. That is not always the case, particularly looking at some countries in Europe right now. I don't think we want to go in that direction. I think we want to continue to be focused on the fact that immigration brings a lot of diversity and a lot of benefit to our communities, and we need it. And we've turned a corner in this province, because 10 years ago, that was not even the sentiment. 10, 15, like we've moved as a province, I think, about the understanding and the acceptability of what that means. But I take your point that we don't want to lose the social license because we don't have the proper supports in place. Yep. I've got this gentleman and then this gentleman.
My question, I'm Greg Hugo,
Yeah.
is around fiscal responsibility to Canadians.
Yep.
The federal employees have grown 40% since Justin Trudeau took power. There doesn't seem to be any, and I know, give some grace, nothing perfect, because we understand we went through a pandemic and whatever plans were had to be thrown out the window. But there's concern that, you know, our competitiveness and the amount of taxation we can burden ourselves with and to give more. And obviously, if the federal social service has grown by 40% in 8 years, most people would think that would be excessive. I do. I think it's crazy. But anyway, and I guess the other thing that I know that Chrystia Freeland avoids the concern about raising gross domestic product per capita. That number really matters, and that seems to be homogenized. And I know it's unfortunate, all of these things are interconnected, but the way that we have increased immigration, we've done that by lowering the standard of immigrant qualification to some regard. So we've increased the volume. Of course, when you increase the volume, you may be bringing in different categories at larger volume. We went away from the traditional model where we brought in really the high-end revenue producers, doctors, lawyers, whatever, really high-skilled tech, working in Waterloo. I guess Waterloo's lost its mojo lately because they're not getting it anymore. So I don't know. I guess you got to be competitive tax-wise a bit to attract the talent from the outside, and they don't all go to the United States, so that we can get our gross domestic product per capita to start growing again. And maybe you can feed back, maybe I'm wrong, about the gross domestic product per capita. As far as I know, it's stagnated, and it's been stagnated for quite some time.
Thanks for being here, and thanks for the question. I'm going to unpack a few things that you said. Part of the 40% increase is tied to the government doing more on programs too. So I take your point that I think Canadians want to make sure that the government is being mindful and prudent with taxpayers' dollars. That is, I think, a core tenet of any government in terms of what we have to do. And I'll get into that in specifically. Because I think we were in Wolfville last night, and one woman came up, and her premise was, look, my grandkids are going to be like, we're in absolute terrible trouble on our fiscal front, and I wanted to address a bit of that, and in part because Canada still has a AAA credit rating. We're one of the few countries in the world that still has that. Our debt to GDP ratio, I'm looking at some of the faces in this room, you would have been around in the 90s. When our numbers were in real dangerous category during the Mulrooney and Chrétien years. God love Mr. Mulrooney, who just passed away, but we were in a much different fiscal context even 10, 15, 20 years ago from where we're at. To your point, Greg, I would agree. I think that there are sometimes efficiencies that can be found in the private sector and how we choose to deliver our services. I don't see Andrea Ferguson here tonight, but I know we might want to talk about childcare at some point and how we can deliver those. So I think it's something the government's looking at. There are internal savings mechanisms. We're trying to save $15 billion in internal government savings over the next 5 years. That is part of what we're looking to do. But I take your point, and I'll continue to push about saying how do we make sure that we're being mindful of how we spend and how we deliver services, and can we find more efficient ways to do that? I think that's a fair comment. Canada has had a number of decades a productivity challenge in comparison to other countries, particularly the United States, but also Europe. So you're right on the GDP per capita. That has not been growing over time. And I think that is something our government has been trying to focus on, particularly in the last couple of years, of saying, how do we address this? How do we incentivize the private sector to want to spend to drive innovation and the growth that we need to drive those overall economic numbers? But you're right, it's a problem. It's been a problem for multiple governments in Canada. And there's a whole, we could do a treatise on the different rationale for why Canada struggles in this particular domain. I think a lot of this comes back to continuing to focus on research and innovation funding, which our government has done, but there's more to be done. Part of it is also sometimes with our close integration with the United States, that some of the major employers in the country are branch plants. They are not necessarily Canadian owned. If Jim Balsillie was sitting here, he would tell us that Canada has not focused enough on intellectual property rights. And that's what drives a lot of the growth now. It's less about GDP, to your point, but it's about actually owning the proprietary knowledge and the innovation that's coming, and Canada has to do a better job on that. So you and I can connect further, and because I would welcome that conversation. I think it's an important one. On immigration, a couple things. I wasn't around during the time that Canada committed to bringing 25,000 Syrian individuals who were being impacted by war. I don't think our policy has changed from a focus on not skilled workers to more of a humanitarian or refugee bent. That's always been part of how Canada approaches immigration. And when I think about some individuals, the Syrian conflict and the war, that was important. I think about our commitments in Afghanistan and the fact that Sean Fraser was the immigration minister at the time, committing to bringing 40,000 Afghans. I think that's part of a moral and ethical responsibility that we had, particularly for those who worked and supported Canadian Armed Forces on the ground. So I'll defend those, but I take your point about we have to remain focused on drawing international talent to Canada. But I wouldn't suggest that our immigration policies have been lacking in that regard. And I think a focus on Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine, these are countries that are experiencing war that Canada has a direct relationship with, and we should be trying to bring people who can create a good life in Canada and can contribute to our economy, notwithstanding if they're not coming in with all the credentials you mentioned. because we still have a pathway for those types of immigrants as well. Yeah, on programs, look, we could talk about them. This government has been focused on a lot on social programs and trying to deliver on that side, and that's what would contribute. I'd be happy to take your ideas. If there's some things that I can take back, I actually chair what's called the Liberal Economic Growth Caucus, and it's members of parliament within our caucus who are particularly focused on that question about productivity and growth, because what we're doing, our debt to GDP ratio is sustainable. We do have a AAA credit rating, but as we add programs that matter to Canadians, we need to make sure we're working with business and we're working with entrepreneurs to grow the economy such that the taxation revenue is sustainable without putting too much pressure on small businesses at the same time. So I want your ideas too. Okay. Yep.
Hi, Kody. Rob Parker.
Hi, Rob.
I'm also from Enfield, like the other Robert back there. We didn't time that. So, Kody, I've written you a couple of emails. I'm glad you. Oh, sorry, Kody. I'm glad you mentioned our Canada's ethical and moral responsibility, to the rest of the world, and that's kind of what I want to talk to you about tonight. Since October 7th, Israel has been indiscriminately bombing the civilian population in Gaza. 15 judges that the International Court of Judges have ruled there's a plausible case for genocide. Kody, when I wrote you emails about this, you gave me a call one day. Unfortunately, I was in the mall and I'm old, so I deleted the message rather than getting to listen to it. But I listened to the first little bit, and I was a bit kind of taken aback that you seemed a bit upset with me probably also. So, Kody, I went and looked at the federal lobbying records. I'm a researcher. That's kind of what I do. And I came across a receipt for a trip for close to $24,000.
Yep.
That you were sent on a trip to Tel Aviv and possibly other places by the Center for International and Jewish Affairs, which is a lobby group, which has been rather aggressively pushing out misinformation. Kody, I'm not here to really give you a hard time. I know it feels like that maybe. Kody, I'm going to ask you, in the current context, you may not have known as much when you took that trip as you do now. Yeah. And we all have maybe had some time to maybe reflect about the actions we've taken. I want to ask you, Kody, given what you know now, see, I appreciate much what you had to say tonight. I'd like to support you, but some things are a bridge too far. Given what you know now, would you still go on that trip? And if you wouldn't, would you commit tonight to paying back that money and freeing yourself up so that you can speak clearly on this matter? Thank you.
Yeah, so, for the benefit of everyone, for years there have been, there's what's called private travel, private sponsored travel. So there'll be organizations in many different contexts where they will encourage members of parliament and they will help support the costs associated with going on trips. Taiwan has been an example, Rob, where there's been a number of trips that have been sponsored in that. We just had colleagues that were actually sponsored by Muslim associations to go to the West Bank to particularly investigate what's going on now. CIJA has traditionally supported a lot of different trips. When I was approached to go on the trip, I said yes, in part because I personally, I wouldn't have had the money to go to that region by myself, and I wouldn't have had the opportunity to go, and I had never been to that region. So your simple answer is yes, I would go again, because it was very enlightening for a number of things. We didn't just go to Tel Aviv. We went to the West Bank. We spent time in Ramallah. We had the chance to sit down with Canada's head of mission to the Palestinian territories. We had the chance to sit down with Arab-Israeli members of the Knesset and to be able to talk about their issues. We were in Ramallah talking to Palestinians about their feeling on how we get towards a two-state solution. And so the idea that somehow this trip has, cast a shadow, we're sitting here, you're able to ask this question in public. Sure. It's fully on the public register. I think it's actually, I would go back and do it again. I want to talk a little bit about the conflict because I think it's important. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the advocacy I have been doing inside our caucus and the conversations that I've had. But for me, what was really enlightening being in Israel and seeing how divisive the Netanyahu government was. Had I never gone on that trip, I don't think I would have ever been able to contextualize and feel that on the ground. We were in Tel Aviv in July. There was like over 100,000 people protesting the Netanyahu government. Before I ever went to the region, I would have presumed that Israel was kind of a homogeneous type of society, that it was kind of like, you know, no, very different in terms of the approach, very different in terms of how religious and fundamental parties within Israel have a lot of control under their proportional representation system. And was able to see how many everyday Israelis were frustrated with the Netanyahu government. We talk about the October 7th attack. I was literally in the area where that happened. So I count myself actually extremely fortunate that I had the chance to go and have some context that allowed me to have an appreciation. Being in Ramallah, talking to our Canadian head of mission, and it was not, you have to go on these trips not saying that you're gonna quote unquote to drink the Kool-Aid. I had a Muslim colleague from Calgary, George Shahal from Calgary Skyview. He's been a very ardent and very public, even at the start in terms of his frustration with the Netanyahu government. He went on that same trip. We had different members of parliament from different parties. So I count myself very lucky. It's all in the public record. Part of what is being discussed right now in Ottawa is actually, there is no ability for members of parliament to travel internationally under the operating budget that we have. I can go to any provincial capital in this country, but I can't go internationally. There is points to New York and Washington. There's a contemplation of actually changing that, and it sounds as though, Rob, that would be something you would welcome, so that members of parliament that want to see different parts of the world or different geopolitical dynamics are able to do that funded by government or through the House of Commons, not through private travel. I actually would really relish that opportunity because then I would have been able to go and facilitate a trip that would have been able to have been paid for by the House of Commons and not through a private party. So to answer your question, no, I would have done it again because it was one of the most enlightening experiences that I had. In terms of the conflict, I put one position paper out back on November 19th in terms of my letter to Melanie Joly. The conflict has evolved over time as well. This was a heinous, terrible attack by Hamas, and it can never be condoned, and I will never condone it. The proportionate response, which has not been proportionate, has been equally terrifying and terrible for innocent civilians in Gaza. I have been appalled to see the way in which the Netanyahu government has talked about reoccupying Gaza. Terrible stuff. And part of what our work has been inside the caucus is a couple things. You mentioned the International Criminal Court of Justice. Our government has been very clear that we support its jurisdiction and its ruling. It's a prima facie case at this point, so if you were to ask me on genocide, I'm not in the place to say that. That's for the court to decide, but we respect its ruling. On arms embargo, which has been coming across my office as well, I actually specifically, particularly for last night's town hall, I wanted to make sure I had the information. When I talk to Global Affairs Canada, there is no lethal weapons coming from Canada directly to Israel to support its war against Hamas, and of course I know your position would be the concern about the civilian impact. But there can be indirectly types of equipment that could be assembled in another country and sent. And so I know that that is a preoccupying concern for many people, and I think it's something the government is looking at and addressing. There is equipment that's sent from Canada that is not in its nature, but one of the examples that was given to me is maybe a scope is exported from Canada to Israel. The scope itself may not cause harm to residents, but it could be used by the Israeli military. How do we find that balance? I mean, those are things that the government's going to continue to look at. UNRWA and the funding of UNRWA has been a big conversation piece. And again, the allegations that are being levied are quite serious to the people that are being identified as potentially involved. And I'm not in a position to say up or down if that's the case. I had a conversation with Minister Hussein last week, actually. Minister Hussein, for the benefit of this room, is the Minister for International Development. He was in Jordan. and he was actually at the Rafah gate, and he said, you know, you would see rockets being shot towards Israel, and you would see airplanes dropping bombs right in the middle of where civilian areas are. So it's a terrible situation all around. Canada has committed, on the UNRWA piece, there's a lot of focus that Canada has cut funding from UNRWA. There's no Canadian funding right now. The way that the installation payments work is that Canada had already sent its requisite funding to UNRWA that will last till April, is my understanding. If we do not renew the funding by April, then there would be a pause in the funding that Canada provides to that organization. Again, the allegations are serious. It's a large organization, I believe, in the tune of about 25 to 30,000 people, and we have to find a way to continue to support Gaza. Canada is the largest contributor towards the humanitarian efforts in Gaza per capita of any country in the world. And I am, you know, the minister has said, particularly on airdrops, that is going to be a focus. And then last piece is this two-state solution. I mean, that has been Canada's position all along. That has not changed. And we have been calling for a ceasefire. I know early on people wanted to see a ceasefire right away. There are still hostages that are held, we believe, by Hamas. I have seen, like you have in the news, the idea that there is a hope that between Arab countries, the United States, Israel, and Hamas, there can be some type of brokered ceasefire, which of course, we want hostages to be returned, and we want to be able to find a peaceful outcome from this. So I know that's a long way of taking the time to try to respond to you. I'm happy to have a further follow-up if you'd like after this. Yeah, again, the experience itself, the fact that it's on the public record, the fact that you can come to a town hall and ask me about it, I don't regret it, because I think it was really enlightening, and it was an important piece for me to have a deeper context for the region that I otherwise would have never had a feel for.
I mean, thank you, Kody. I appreciate your explanation, and I'm not gonna hijack the whole meeting on this subject. My disappointment, you know, I grew up walking the same streets as you did in this community. You know, I'm also a blue-collar guy, and that trip was $24,000 over 8 days, and I don't understand how you're spending nearly $3,000 a day on a trip from an influential Israeli lobby, how you're getting to see how Palestinians live, and how you're getting to see how Palestinians live under that occupation. I just don't understand how you went on that trip and spent that amount of money and then got any kind of perspective, you know, especially because the people who send you on that trip, you know, they have an agenda, you know, and they...
And Rob, as I said in my remarks...
And hold on, I'm just gonna finish this up. After the conflict started, I was looking eagerly for public statements from you, and all I saw was you criticizing protesters. And you writing letters to Melanie Joly asking that there be no ceasefire. When it was apparent, you made it apparent in your letter. You stated in your own letter to her that you knew that there was a humanitarian disaster, and you still refused to ask for a ceasefire. So I want to know, Kody, if I gave you $24,000 and then you refuse to ask for a ceasefire, is that a quid pro quo? I mean, you can see how it looks. So that's why I'm asking you to pay back the money. It's not for my sake, it's for yours.
Sure. So the trip, it was my spouse and myself. Members of Parliament were entitled. There was others that did that. It's all on the public record. It's there. I have the letter to Minister Joly. I'm happy to share this with the group. I see you're recording the entire response here today. I've been very clear that in the midst of how this conflict has evolved, I wanted to see, there was a lot of language around ceasefire versus humanitarian pause. The feeling from many, we don't have a large Jewish population in Kings-Hants, there are some families, and I've had conversations with them, and this has been a very difficult conversation within the own Liberal caucus.
I mean, I don't
Rob, if I
understand
could,
the connection
Rob,
between Kings-Hants and Israel. Like, is there some
Rob?
trade deal between Palestine and Israel that we don't know? But like, why are you involved?
Rob,
That's what I don't get.
I listened to your question respectfully. I'd ask that you listen to my response. Part of my job as a member of Parliament is to listen to my constituents. There are Jewish members here that have a different view about the dynamic that happens on the Middle East. That's a reality. There might be people in this room that have a different dynamic about what is happening and how that's playing out. As a member of Parliament, I have to try to sort through that. I have to be able to try to advocate. I've told you the work that I've done with our Muslim caucus in trying to make sure that Canada continues to provide the aid. Canada has been very clear in calling for a ceasefire. In the time that I wrote the letter to Minister Joly, I made very clear that I supported the work to stop the conflict, conditional on Hamas surrendering, and to be able to actually release the hostages. So I don't want my words to be misconstrued. I have copies of the letter, I'll make sure that they're there. But yeah, it's a terrible situation that's happening right now. And I know many people feel helpless in terms of how they contribute, how they can help. Part of my work as a member of parliament has been to try to work with our cabinet ministers who have portfolios that can touch on this conflict, and to try to find an ability for Canada to help diplomatically resolve what's happening right now. Because it is a terrible situation. We have condemned the Israeli government's statements, particularly on the resettlement, the further settlements in the West Bank, and the fact that we think that they have been indiscriminate, to your point. So it's out there on the public record. I'm glad that I went on the trip. I'm glad I had the opportunity to be there. Members of parliament are entitled to take that. You're entitled to ask questions and hold me to account in the public forum. And I'll let my constituents and I'll let the Canadian public decide in terms of what it is. And there would be a long list of individuals who have taken that trip. In terms of both all parties and many members of parliament that have gone. I believe Mr. Singh with the NDP has also gone on that trip. Look, there is a long list because I've looked at it before. And I'm happy in the fact that I think we're actually going to have a mechanism for members of parliament moving forward, that private travel will not be an element, and we won't be forced to choose, would I like to be able to go learn more about an actual requisite situation. You talk about the cost, Rob. You talk about the cost. A flight to Tel Aviv, a flight and the hotels and the travel and the transportation, it's an expensive trip to be able to go. I wouldn't have been able to have that opportunity otherwise. I want to be able to move on. If you want to talk about this after, happy to do so, okay?
On a little lighter note, maybe.
Sure.
I'm one of the more seniors in the room.
Okay.
Born in 1940. So I go back to prime ministers previous to Pearson and Diefenbaker and all of those boys. My greatest problem these days, being very busy, doing work all the time, is every time I try to phone somebody, I get what I consider to be the biggest con job in the country. Your call is important to us. Please stay on the line and we'll answer as soon as we can, sort of thing. So I've been on the phone this past week probably 2.5 hours trying to get, one, in touch with my doctor to get a prescription changed, two, trying to get involved with the provincial government department, etc. You know the thing it is. All I would say is, because I don't have an app, in fact, what is it? This is my telephone and my watch, because I can't wear a watch. So I don't have all that fancy stuff, and personally I never had the opportunity to learn it. At this age I'm not going to start because I'm too busy doing lots of other things for the community. But if more of the departments, and some of them are beginning to get this now, say, have an opportunity for you to say, leave your name and telephone number, and we'll get back to you as soon as we're clear. Yep. Instead of going on and on and on, please stay on the line, your call will be answered, blah, blah, blah. And I find that people who do that, leave that message, so that I have an option, I can leave a name and a telephone number, they really do get back to me.
Yep. Okay.
And it's helpful for us real old guys and whatever who don't know how to use computers.
Or you don't look that old. No, I take your point about service delivery, how we can find efficiencies, and walking that balance between little things like you said about being able to have people call you back at your convenience and not waiting, not knowing where you're at in the queue or how much the estimated time is, versus also digital piece, because maybe I feel like I'm 70 or 33 going on 73 at times. I'm not that tech savvy myself. But the digital piece of government being ease of doing business is a good thing, but we have to balance that versus some citizens who may not have access to a phone, might not have access to a computer and those digital tools. So I'll take it away, particularly the fact that you like this callback option. That should be almost something implemented across the entire government.
Just so many of them don't have that option on it. You just have to sit and wait, or finally throw the phone down.
Yeah.
Heck with it.
Yeah. Don't be shy. Oh, just at the back.
Hi Kody, I'm Karen Sampson.
Hi, Karen.
My question is about childcare.
Yep.
I know you met a couple weeks ago with the directors of a few centers, both not-for-profit and for-profit. And I know that the Canada-wide agreement was signed with an option for an amendment.
Yep.
And I'm wondering what you can do to push the government of Nova Scotia to make an amendment
Yep.
to the agreement to support our local owners.
Yep.
I think it's ridiculous. I think we live in a totally different part of the country that is not as represented, not represented the same as the rest of the country. In our area, in Atlantic Canada, we private owners were the people that made up childcare. There wasn't a lot of not-for-profit, whereas the rest of the country, I know, is basically a lot of not-for-profit. So private owners aren't getting any respect or any help, and they're struggling. Centers are closing. My center closed. I'm now working elsewhere. So there's 20 spaces that are gone from our local area. We meet parents daily that are constantly looking for childcare, and we have to tell them that we have 300 people on a waiting list. They have no chance of getting childcare. What can be done?
Yep, so, Karen, I know you'll know this, but I just want to explain to the broader group about the childcare piece. And look, I think, notwithstanding the challenges, because we had Minister Suds, she is the minister responsible for families, in East-Hants 2 weeks ago, to Karen's point. Because for a long time, we talked about a national childcare policy as being something really important to be able to help get parents back to work, to make sure that, particularly for the kids, that we have parameters and programs to help support their early learning and education. So I don't think, notwithstanding, I'll address Karen's point, we still have to celebrate this has been a relatively good thing because it's increased wages for workers. We've made sure that there's protocol in place that I think is going to have long-term benefits. The challenge has always been how are you going to add the additional spaces to meet the demand that a $10 a day program would bring more and more families to want to participate. There is an agreement right now between the Government of Canada and the Government of Nova Scotia to create an additional 9,000 spaces by 2026. Right now, the province has created, I think based on their action plan, about 3,300 of those spaces. A lot of the folks who are even closer to this would say a lot of those are after-school programs and not necessarily about creating new spaces in the types of places we would think like Tots or Elmwood or et cetera. Part of the agreement, the boilerplate agreement from the Government of Canada was focused on saying if you're going to create additional seats and there's going to be Government of Canada money involved, we'd like to see that in a not-for-profit space. And Karen, to your point, I think it's legitimate not to have Government of Canada money going to build infrastructure that long-term will be held by private enterprise. But it is a different piece to say that someone who has been doing this for a long time, who could go borrow from the bank, build the infrastructure and deliver the service similar to what our physicians might in this province who are privately incorporated but delivering a public service, I don't see any issue with that. I remember flagging this early for Minister Gould. There are some provinces that do allow privately incorporated, and I want to stress the difference because sometimes people say for-profit. Well, for-profit gives this idea that it's a runaway environment and people are getting rich off of this. Nova Scotia has had a long history of privately incorporated childcare centers that are regulated under a conditional model in the province. I think of one that I went to, which is Carmy's. We had the chance to be there the other day. It was a real flashback. The province itself has gone down a pathway of Childcare Nova Scotia, a not-for-profit agency. I have concerns as a representative, and I understand the ideals and around, okay, not-for-profit, great. I worry about, particularly in rural communities, having the volunteer base and the apparatus to build the infrastructure and to have the board of governance in place. Having run two not-for-profit organizations in East-Hants, kind of in what I would call, this is the corridor, kind of the heart, the urban area, if you will, of East-Hants, it was not easy to find volunteers even a few years ago, and I know it's not easy to find these volunteers moving forward. So Karen, I am more than on board. I have a letter nearly finished on the side of my desk that will be going to Minister Drouin, the Provincial Minister of Early Education. The province has to signal that they want to make an amendment to the agreement, and there's a clear precedent in PEI, New Brunswick and Alberta, that, and I don't want to hold the hands of our government. Look, I've been critical of my own government where I think it's necessary. I will do so if I need to again, but even getting up to the levels of other provinces that have clearly negotiated those deals should be within Nova Scotia's reach. So I'm fully on board. Andrea Ferguson, who I mentioned earlier, she's been quite vocal on my social media. I see the posts, I see, and it's great.
Vocal with us as well.
and it's important, but the advocacy is a bit misdirected at this point. Because without a provincial government, you mentioned the country being different, and yeah, maybe there was a certain bias from a downtown, sure. But when you have a provincial government saying we want to go childcare Nova Scotia route, my federal minister is not in a position to amend an agreement if her provincial colleagues aren't actually asking for that amendment to happen. You'll remember a year ago, Karen, a lot of privately incorporated childcare spaces raised concerns and went to the Houston government,
Oh, yeah.
and they were shot down, as you know.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if the Houston government's going to change its approach. My focus as a member of parliament, and I'd be happy to work with you, I said this to Andrea, happy to work with John locally. How do we make sure that we do continue to grow spaces? Because as far as I know, I don't think there's been a single space added by the province who actually delineates where those new spaces go as well. So part of my letter to Minister Drouin will be twofold. One, it'll be, please focus on our communities in Kings-Hants, like East-Hants and others. The second piece will be, look, I'm open. If this is something the province wants to go to, I'm happy to engage with my federal colleagues. But I can't, like, our minister's not gonna preemptively just say, let's do it this way, because we've taken an approach that we've left it to the provinces to help do it. We've put the money on the table, we've set some of the parameters, and then we've said, look, make sure you deliver, and I think that that's still wanting at this point. Great program if you have access to the space. We've cut childcare fees by 50%. Like, let's not underestimate what that represents. That is, I think, transformational for many, but we have to add the other spaces, and I think we've protected the existing business model of those who are privately incorporated. That's great, but those are some of the people that have the best ability to scale up, and that's where my position is. So help me, join me, like I'm with you. I'm just not in.
Believe me, we've
Yep.
been doing it since it was
Good.
announced, and it's a fantastic program.
Yep.
In theory, it's just, the
Yep.
delivery model is not working.
Well-
And it's unfortunate for families who think that there should be childcare available and are shocked when they find out that they need childcare in 3 months, and they're not gonna get it in 5 years.
Is there a
like
shortage,
3
though,
months.
of early childhood educators? Isn't that the big problem?
There's, some of that would be, I mean, I've said this, Greg, I'm the first member of parliament since Confederation who's more worried about finding people for the jobs that exist than finding the jobs for the people. It's inverse. So yes, there are gonna be challenges with the actual personnel. But for example, what has been frustrating, and Karen probably could articulate this because she's been closer to it, there have been examples where some privately incorporated centers could maybe take another 10 or 15 spaces, and the province thus far has said no. So that's where the frustration lies as well, in terms of you have folks with staff who might only have to add 1 staff and they could add 20, and there's been a bit of resistance on that side. So Karen, I'm not a minister, provincial or federal.
And I understand that, Kody, and I
Yeah.
know, but I also know that the federal government is the one providing a lot of the money on the table for this.
Mhm.
And there should be a way to add a little bit of pressure to the government that's not delivering what they say they're delivering.
Yep.
They've lost almost as many spaces as they've created. I think there's 3 months ago, it was 63 spaces they created. That's not what they're telling everybody.
Sure.
But that's what they've created because of how many spaces have been
Well,
lost.
and-
And it's unfortunate that you guys can't put a little bit of pressure somewhere.
Well, and asking privately incorporated folks to change over the business model, which many have said they want, and
They
it
didn't
comes.
ask us to transfer,
Or they
they
telling you.
asked us to hand our keys over and walk away, is
Sure.
what they asked.
Yep.
In all fairness, though.
No, and what I'm saying is I share your frustration. Thank you for coming here today. I'll make sure my letter's public. You can share that, and let's do it together. And I'm not out to play gotcha politics. I like John, he works hard, but I need him to also help support this, and also the creation of new spaces. But if that's a policy change the provincial government wants to come in, they need to start signaling it. And as you know, they have not done anything to that effect. But I take your point about what we can do to hold mechanisms the same way.
Just an observation on it, Kody and Karen's husband, but you provide the funding agreement, you set the parameters, right? Couldn't it be a parameter that you can't do
We
this?
are designing.
So where I will accept that I wish our government would have taken a different approach is we said on existing spaces in the province, privately incorporated businesses, we would continue to fund $10 a day, and we would subsidize enterprises in that way to help bring down the cost. There was a view from the Government of Canada that on the additional spaces, the priority should be given for not-for-profit centers. And look, I can see why some people would think that way. In Nova Scotia, as you know, And as Karen knows, 60% of our childcare centers are, or were certainly privately incorporated. Nova Scotia they signed on the deal as is. What Karen knows is that other provinces have negotiated and altered the agreement to ask for an additional augmentation of a percentage of private spaces to be available on the expansion. If the provincial government wants to do that, there is a mechanism in the agreement to amend. There is an ability to go back and say, hey, we maybe even thought this was a good idea, clearly not working out the way we might have anticipated. Let's allow a different mechanism. I'm supportive of that because I think at the end of the day, the agreement, I don't see someone who owns a privately incorporated business who's delivering a public service at a reasonable rate. I think that's fine. In fact, I think there can be efficiencies. I don't want to name a daycare, but let's just say Carmi, for example. I'm not saying she's in this position, but she's been doing this for 30 years. Maybe she's been able to pay off her mortgage. Maybe she's able to go borrow from a bank at a rate, create a space, deliver a service that actually would be competitive, if not better than a not-for-profit in terms of the overall cost, because otherwise the not-for-profit agency would have to go find infrastructure and do it. So the idea that not-for-profit can deliver the service at a higher quality and a lower cost, I don't see that as being borne out. But again, we need the province to change its tack because they've gone down a certain track and they don't seem to want to change them. Thank you for being here tonight.
Yeah, Kody, it's Brad Hodgins from Enfield as well. I have a question about the follow-up to the Mass Casualty Commission.
Okay.
This area was particularly affected, of course, and notwithstanding the fact that it's a federal, provincial, jurisdictional file,
Yep.
there were some pretty good recommendations, and I'm just wondering if there's any way to keep track of what's going on with those, and whether or not that can be pushed along a little further or a little quicker.
I would be lying, Brad, if I said that I've got that sitting by my bedside. I haven't. I know that part of the recommendations was to provide funding to service-based organizations in our community. I was actually, when I was with Minister Suds, we went to East-Hants Community Learning Association and the Family Resource Network. I know they've been a beneficiary of funds to help support people, not just those who are closely related, but just people that have expressed, that have had trauma. But look, it's something I can take away. I'm sure what's happening right now is that you have multiple different departments, both provincially and federally, in different agencies that are looking at those recommendations and moving on them. But if there's something specific from the MCC report that you think is pertinent, I'm happy to go try to push it.
Well, it's the provincial contract for policing.
Yep.
That in lots of parts of the country, that doesn't exist, or certainly not the same as it is here with a number of provinces. So that really does have to be re-examined,
Yep.
I would think.
Yeah, I think rural policing in general, going back to the gaps, there'd be certain communities in this area, in Kings-Hants, where the response time is quite significant in the fact that you don't have enough officers to be able to maintain, particularly in larger communities, where a detachment may not be close by in the response.
Yeah.
You look at, there was a number of failings, as the commission highlights, in terms of what happens in Portapic. But I think having a conversation about how we fund reasonably to make sure that there's enough police resources in communities is a big thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, but happy to talk about the more specifics on that. So.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Excuse me, Kody, on that, I thought there was something on where there were 2 people hired to monitor the progress and report the progress. It's not in the news, so.
Okay.
I don't know whose name is, because we would have to hire to do that.
Sure. So there's that on that side, but we're happy to look into it. And I hear you on the provincial, the contract.
Thanks.
Good to see Perry. Hi, Perry. We were just, you were name dropped earlier about Barney's Brook. You and I will have to talk. Good.
Appreciate it.
I don't see, Sam, back to you.
Earlier you mentioned that the Israeli government is governed under PR, proportional representation.
Yep.
I didn't know that, so I appreciate you informing us of that.
Yep.
If anybody can correct me if I'm wrong, if I remember right, when Trudeau was first elected in 2015,
Yep.
one of his election promises was election reform and proportional representation. And I hear a lot of people still wanting reform at least, and a lot of people want proportional representation. Is that something that's hopeless to expect from the Liberal government at this point,
So
going
I wanna
forward
walk-
before an election? Or?
Yeah, look, I don't think, we're not gonna have a change in our electoral system before the next federal election. I'm not the Prime Minister, I'm not in cabinet, but I can safely say that's just not gonna be on the table. But we had I had about a lot of conversations on this because there was a motion put forward by, I believe it was Lisa Barron from the NDP, to form a citizens assembly. It was called M86, and it was a vote that I voted for at second reading, ultimately abstained on the third reading, and it failed. I had about 15 calls to my office. People, if you generally write out, I do try to call back. I know, Rob, sometimes I get voicemails, and we keep our best to stay on top of calls. But what the motion called for was an assembly to consider electoral reform. I wasn't in Parliament from 2015 to 2019, but this was studied extensively. There is certainly a movement and a desire, I think, amongst at least half the population to examine a different voting system. Very difficult to actually converge on what that is. What was on offer in 2015 to 2019 in that Parliament was a ranked ballot that would actually allow for more choice for people when they go. The NDP and the Greens at the time rejected that concept of a ranked ballot. And my personal view on this, because I have been, not forced, but because of the debate, we've had to think about a lot about this. I think a ranked ballot would be a good benefit. When you look at proportional representation, here's my concern. I just talked to you about the Israeli Knesset and how they don't even have ridings. Like, you're just strictly elected on a party list and you go in based on that. I think there's something actually beneficial about our system, because here we are sitting here tonight, and I'm directly responsible and accountable to you and people in Kings-Hants. Part of what we're doing today is, Sam, you come and ask me questions, you're one of my constituents. I like that direct representation, I think it's important. Atlantic Canada is right now overrepresented in the House of Commons. We have about 10% of the seats in the House, we have about 7% of the national population. I can tell you firsthand, it is not easy to be able to make issues that are specific to the Atlantic region become absolute national priorities, even within our caucus. I'll give, before Christmas, you would have saw some of my work around adjustments to the carbon price, an increase in the rural rebate, an exemption on home heating oil for 3 years while we rolled out an enhanced heat pump program. That was a program that will make a difference across the country. It was particularly a pertinent issue in Atlantic Canada. It was not easy to be able to get movement on those things. So what I worry about a proportionate moving towards that model of a PR is that it would open up the conversation that Atlantic Canada's requisite voice in the Federation, as it relates to the House of Commons, would become less and less. Where I can tell you, after 5 years doing this job, it's not easy to elevate those issues already within the parliamentary structures that we have. I also think it gives a voice to some real extreme parties. Now, I started this conversation tonight by saying that I'm a centrist. Someone down the middle that tries to draw from both sides. I think there's good ideas out there, but generally I fit kind of as a moderate. Would I be as perplexed to see Elizabeth May have a few more seats in the House? Not so much. But I don't want to see Max Bernier with the People's Party of Canada have more seats. Now, if you take that perspective, I think that it is important and incumbent on parties to try to bring people together and to try to be able to have enough requisite support to actually get voted into the House. I don't think we need any more extreme in our politics. I see what's going on in certain parties in Europe. You referenced Israel. You could look at, I think we want to have ways that actually bring people together, and a ranked ballot would give people more choice. It would give people more ability to go in and say, this is my absolute preference of who I want, but I can live with this individual as a candidate if not. And I think there's a way to do that without going down the line to proportional. So the reason I abstained on M86 was because I think that there is some need to look at electoral reform. Particularly, I would be in preference of a ranked ballot. But also the reason why I didn't vote for it is because I think it's disingenuous in this time frame. Like, we're not going to have a system in place before the next election. And also the polling rate now shows that it's not that favorable for us. It would look a bit disingenuous to try to set up a system that may be electorally favorable in the short term on the basis that somehow that was the case. But remember, it was on the table. This was here. And the Prime Minister had acknowledged that that was part of the SACA conversation, the Supply and Confidence Agreement, that we were willing to explore a ranked ballot, which in certain parts of the country would really favor other parties other than the Liberals. In other parts of the country, actually, a Liberal vote share in some ways can knock off NDP or Green candidates that would be more likely to win in certain areas of the country. I also think, as a Member of Parliament, I mean, I had 45% of the vote here in Kings-Hants of those who cast ballots in 2021. I'm proud of that number. Like, that's not a small amount amongst those who voted, but it would be nice in theory to kind of have a 50+1. You have to be able to get across that threshold that enough people actually view you as an acceptable choice to be the Member of Parliament. I think there's merit to that.
And I'm a little bit of a critic of the idea of PR for similar reasons to you say. I'm worried about losing local representation because of getting it in exchange for proportional representation for all the parties. But I'm just still curious, is electoral reform or proportional representation something that you hear much talk about from the inside?
Well, not necessarily from the inside. I mean, right now, most of what I come through my office is affordability, it's international conflict and how Canada can respond. There's been a lot of conversations from my constituents, I'm talking, Sam, about defense and a changing world-built environment. We haven't talked much about that today. I was born in 1991. It was the fall of the Soviet Union at that time. Berlin Wall had been coming down 2 years before. There was this idea that it was the end of ideology, that Western liberal democracy, that viewpoint had kind of won out. With Russia's terrible invasion into Ukraine and what we're seeing in conflicts around the world, I think Canada has to be prepared to be able to defend its own sovereignty, to be able to work with allies to secure peace and freedom and our interests. And you look at the prospect, I mean, look, people will know probably where I stand on what I would like to see out of the American presidential election, particularly with Trump's comments on the fact that he is mused about the idea of not supporting NATO allies that somehow don't have the funding. Like, we can no longer rely on the United States and its military umbrella to be supporting our North American security. We need to make sure. Our government actually has probably a better story than most people in this room would give us credit for. Defense spending has increased every year under this government since we took over from the Harper Conservatives. Most people don't know that. Spending has gone from 1% of GDP on defense to 1.4%. There's more work to be done in terms of making sure our Canadian Armed Forces are there, but yeah, I'm sorry, we got from PR to defense spending, sorry, but...
no worries, I appreciate the conversation.
But yeah, I think it's important, and I hear you on electoral reform. I don't hear a lot of it coming through. I know it's important to segments of the population, and I think we want to encourage people to get out. Again, with a ranked ballot, you, for example, could say, Sam, you know, Kody's not a bad guy. I hope that's what you would say, but, you know, I really want this person to be my #1 candidate. But I could live with Kody down ballot. I think that would allow for more elements. I think it would also mean that candidates have to be more pragmatic. It doesn't mean that I'm just chasing 40% of a certain type of demographic to the detriment of 60%. And the way I've tried to be a Member of Parliament in Kings-Hants, I would argue that our communities, they are diverse, but most people are reasonable, moderate people. They don't like extremes too far other ways. There would be some people that do, of course, but on the whole. So I've tried to be someone that is not really extreme one way or the other. I think having a ranked ballot would mean candidates of other parties would have to be open, acceptable to voters that may not be exactly part of their base, so to speak. And I think that that's a good thing about bringing us together. I want to take maybe one final question, and then I'm happy to mull around and stick around forever. Thank you again for coming.
I'm just curious, again, on Glenn's stance.
Yeah.
Protesters.
Yep.
Trudeau's and Freeland's strain, your government's stance to invoke the, not the Low Measures Act, National Security, whatever it was, the act.
Yep.
And freeze people's bank accounts. Where do you stand on that, considering your comments on extreme governments and
Sure. Yeah, look, I was in Ottawa at the time, Glenn, back in February of 2022. And what I would say is a couple things. I remember at the time there was real frustration because, look, we had been going on almost 2 years of the pandemic. I think everyone was ready to try to move on. It had been a real challenge in a lot of people's lives. And I think everyone can sit back at a certain time and armchair this and say, well, the government, the policies, because remember, they weren't all federal. A lot of these were provincial as well. I think everyone can sit back and say, well, governments were too cautious, or maybe they should have been more you know, on top of it, whatever. People are gonna have that different spectrum of what they thought was acceptable risk. There's people in this room right now that would have had relatively low risk as it relates to COVID, and there's some people in this room that would have had a lot higher risk to COVID. I actually think our entire approach to COVID-19, yeah, maybe we were too restrictive longer, maybe, but the whole emphasis was trying to protect lives. And the emphasis was trying to make sure that people were gonna be able to go home and see their families. I'll take criticism whether or not we did well enough or not on that. I actually think even Trudeau's harshest critics, when I went to the door in 21 and otherwise, would say, no, actually your government did pretty good on pandemic. I don't really like you guys, but I thought you did okay there. Emergencies Act itself, the idea that this was, everyone that was there was a bad person or that they were out with bad motives, no, absolutely not. I was there, and I spent 3 weeks going, like, sorting my way through the House of Commons, you know, through what was going on. There were some well-intended people that were frustrated about government policy, that were upset and wanted to express themselves. There were people there that I think had other motives, and they were a little bit darker than, you know, they were upset about government policy. There were people that openly spouted about the idea of trying to overthrow governments. That may seem far-fetched to us in this room, but it is serious, and some of the conduct was quite terrible. I don't live in Ottawa. I stay in a hotel when I'm there. If you were an Ottawa resident, you were pretty sick of this. You couldn't get out of your house. The honks were going all night. There had to be some way to bring this to, like, the point had been made, Glenn. And when people refused to follow the orders of police to disperse and to go down, there was a clear lack of leadership at the municipal and provincial level to try to deal with what was happening. It wasn't just in the nation's capital. There was border crossings that were being blocked that were having impact on trade. When you look at the threshold in the Emergencies Act, it is a security threat to Canada. People can interpret that different ways. I think the majority of my constituents I talk to actually think, some people say, why did the government take so long to try to help out and deal with this, right? This will be appealed. I think ultimately it'll be a further definition of what actually constitutes a security threat to Canada, and whether or not that has to be changed, I don't know. In a perfect world, Ottawa Police and the Ontario Provincial Police could have been able to handle this so that everyday businesses and residents didn't have to be completely inundated and impacted. But I think at a certain point it became that the Government of Canada had to act in concert with those types of local police authorities to support it. It was a 10-day element. I know for those who were closest to it and who may not have liked the federal policies, they would say, well, look, this was heavy-handed, this was shitty. I don't see it that way, and ultimately I also appreciate if the court says that we didn't quite get it right, there's a mechanism for parliamentarians to vote on it, and now we'll further know what the threshold actually is. This had been the first time it had ever been used. The War Measures Act was a much more restrictive policy where it suspended all civil liberties. This was quite narrow. It was about largely the requisition of tow trucks to be able to actually try to remove some of the heavy vehicles out of Ottawa. So look, Canadians are going to have their say. It'll get appealed, I suspect, to a higher court. We'll see if that decision is upheld. And I think most Canadians have had kind of their view on whether or not it was good or bad. I don't think it was facetious of the government to implement. I don't think it was done in bad faith. I think it was trying to help a situation to resolve the issue, particularly in Ottawa and elsewhere in the country. Look, let me say this. It's March 5th on a Tuesday, 8 o'clock in Lance, and we have, 25, 30 people out to a town hall. I think that's important. I want to thank you for coming today, honestly. I appreciate the tough questions, appreciate the feedback, because I've been taking notes the whole time. Part of what I've tried to brand myself on is being accessible and open and having difficult conversations, because it's not just about conversations with people that says you're awesome and you're doing great, don't change a thing. I do love those too once in a while, but that's not the only element of the job. So thank you for coming today. I'll stick around a little bit after. Lino, you're gonna.
One more question. I started from the slide, right?
Oh my God, you're heavy-handed. But let me just say thank you. If people have to go, I understand, but I will stick around after.
You said you wanted to can't have a hat with the other one on, is something coming to the municipality from the feds to help with this housing crisis? I'm a local developer.
You'll have something soon. Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Money or bailout?
Both. I won't say anything more, but it's to be determined.
Cash or debt?
You come out.
Is it free money or we have to pay back?
Oh well, we'll see.
Yeah, well, this is-
Everybody likes free.